Hi everyone and welcome back to Brian's Horror Corner, or welcome if you are new to my channel. So of course we're going to continue with the 1980 horror movies. It's part of my overall 1980s horror movie series. So today we're going to take a look at a movie. It's the one movie out of 1980 of all of them that I'm going to review that I don't have in my collection. This is a movie that I watched on Shudder. It's a first time watch for me, but it's a movie that's on Shudder. So you're not going to see a cover or a case or anything because I don't have this movie. Am I going to get it? You'll have to wait till the end of the video to find out. But yeah, anyway, I just want, with that being said, let's go ahead and talk about Funeral Home from 1980. So Funeral Home, originally known as Cries in the Night, is a 1980 Canadian slasher film directed by William Freud and starring Leslie Donaldson, Kay Hawtrey, and Jack Van Avira, Elf Humphreys, and Harvey Atkin. The plot follows a teenager spending the summer at her grandmother's inn, formerly a funeral home, where guests begin to disappear. So basically, I should mention, briefly released in Eastern Canada in 1980, the film premiered in the United States. It was re-released in its native Canada. Wait a minute now. Briefly released in Eastern Canada in 1980, the film premiered in the United States and was re-released in Canada under the alternative title Funeral Home in the summer of 1982. So that's why if you look up this movie, some places you'll see it 1982 under Funeral Home, and then if you search for it under 1980, you'll see it as Cries of the Night. I know that's what it is on Wikipedia, so just an FYI there. It says 1982 for Funeral Home, but this movie actually was first released in Canada in 1980 and then in the United States in 1982. But Funeral Home or Cries of the Night, whatever title you'd like. So it received mixed reviews from critics, with several noting its starkly redolent of... No, I'm not going to mention that. That's kind of a spoiler. So, mixed reviews from critics. So, the movie opens at the beginning of the summer. Heather arrives in a small, unnamed town to stay with her eccentric and religious grandmother, Maud Chalmers, whose house, a former funeral home, has recently been converted into an inn. Maud's husband, James, an undertaker, has been missing for several years, and she has been forced to make a living selling artificial flower arrangements. She hopes to supplant her income by opening the home to traveling guests. Billy Hibbs, a mentally challenged man, lives with Maud as the property handyman. Nearby, a farmer named Sam reports an abandoned vehicle discovered on his property, which is traced to a missing real estate developer who has been surveying the area. At the inn, on the evening of Heather's arrival, guests Harry Browning and his mistress Flory check in. When Maud realizes the couple are unmarried, she asks them to leave, but they refuse. That evening, after having drinks, they drive to a local quarry recommended by Heather. Well, there, Maud's truck arrives, smashing the back of their car and pushing them into the water below, where they both drown. The same night, Heather goes on a date with Rick, a local teenager, and returns home to hear her Maud speaking to an unseen man in the basement. When she inquires, Maud denies it. So that's the setup and the premise, the beginning of Funeral Home from 1980. As far as the cast goes, we have Kay Hawtrey as Maud Chalmers, Leslie Donaldson as Heather, Barry Morse as Mr. Davis, Dean Garbett as Rick Yates, Stephen E. Miller as Billy Hibbs, Elf Humphreys as Joe Yates, Peggy Mahan as Flory, Harvey Atkin as Harry Browning, Robert Warner as the sheriff, and Jack Van Avira as James Chalmers. So yeah, that's the setup, the premise, and the cast for the 1980 Canadian slasher film Funeral Home. So I didn't know much about this movie. I actually had it saved on YouTube, and then I saw that it was going to be dropping on Shudder. I figured it might look better on Shudder. Probably the same movie, but so I watched it on there instead of YouTube, and it's kind of a hard movie to review because on one hand, there's some charm to this movie, but on the other hand, it's definitely not one of the... If I was doing a list of 1980s slasher movies, I don't think it's going to make the top 20 of 1980s. From the 80s, I should say. So let's just go ahead and get into it, starting with the things that I liked about the movie. And you got to start with the small town setting. I mean, that's one of my favorite tropes in horror movies, if you want to call it a trope. I guess you can. But I just like when movies start in a small town, which is sort of isolated from the rest of the world. Um, it's just one of my favorite horror movie tropes. I think it works really well here, where there are different people around town spreading rumors, ideas, hearsay, where what's going on is sort of cut off from the rest of the world, as I said. You have the local sheriff that isn't used to like huge murders or investigations. It's basically, investigating a squabble at the old folks' home or something out in the country. So it has that isolation aspect to it that I really enjoy about small town horror movie settings. Also, the former funeral home, or the house as it is now, the inside of it especially is pretty cool looking too. Some parts of it where there's a lot of suspense and creepy stuff that takes place in this movie. I thought it works pretty well, especially as our characters stumble into the garage and the basement that still has regiments of the funeral home that once stood there. So yeah, you see different things, like there's a hearse in the garage, there's some tables where they had cadavers on them, there's embalming fluid. There's just different things to prove that it was once a funeral home before it was this kind of a motel, a house to take in guests and stuff to stay there. So another pro you got to talk about, I think, the performance and the character of Maud Chalmers, played by Kay Hawtrey. I don't know if I've seen her in anything else, but she plays the grandmother. I thought she was really quite good in this movie. Both the character, who has kind of an arc in this movie. It's interesting because, well, I don't want to give too much away here, but she has an interesting arc where she has to go places that aren't easy for just any actor or actress to do. And she does a good job with that, but also her character is written more interestingly than the rest of the characters of this movie. So I definitely wanted to call out her performance in that character in this movie as being a positive. If the grandma character of Maud Chambers wasn't good, wasn't acted well, wasn't written well, the movie would collapse under the weight of it, given what this movie's about and the big twist that we get at the end. So it would just be bad in that regard. So the movie does improve, I'll say, and get better as it goes on. And I bring up that pro, you'll know why in a couple minutes when I get into my cons here, but it has a pretty decently strong third act and climax with a twist that we get, which I don't know if I want to comment on the twist. It's a decent twist. I'm not going to say that everybody that watches it isn't going to see it coming in some way. And this movie definitely pays homage to an older horror movie that came out before this, which I'm also not going to give away because spoiler-free review here as much as I can. But if you've seen the movie, you know what movie I'm talking about that it pays homage to. If you haven't seen the movie, you're going to have to watch it to figure it out. But it's not very difficult. I didn't think it was the worst twist in the world, but I've certainly been more blown away by twists in horror movies as well. But it does have a good suspenseful chase and creepy atmosphere, especially in that third act, towards the end of the movie as well, that I'll give it credit for. And then my final pro for the movie, I think William Freud, who'd go on to be... He's kind of green when he makes this movie. I think he does better stuff down the road after this movie. In fact, he directed a lot of the Goosebumps series that came out in 1995. And when I discovered that, when I read that, then this movie made a little bit more sense on why he directed it, because in some ways this almost is a Goosebumps episode, like a long one. But I thought he did well, given the lower budget and the constraints that this movie clearly had. I think a lesser director that didn't have as much talent, I don't think the movie would have turned out as well as it did. So even though it didn't turn out awesome, it still turned out better because you had William Freud's involvement. Hopefully that makes sense to you. But there's some directors that know how to get as much as they can out of as little resource and money as they're given. And those are the directors that tend to be the most successful, in my opinion. So kudos to William Freud, a very early movie for William Freud. And like I said, he'd go on and do better things, in my opinion. So now getting on to the cons of the movie. And for me, this movie is just kind of overall bland for the most part. I'm guessing this was a PG movie in 1980. I'd be shocked if it was an R-rated movie because there's no nudity in it. I don't think there's even any F-bombs or harsh language, which is fine. There were a lot of good PG horror movies. Just see from the year before, see Tourist Trap. But the movie's just kind of bland. It starts very slow, and this is where I got into that one of those pros I mentioned, how the movie does get better as it goes on. It doesn't start out better. It doesn't start out good. It starts very slow, and it's really hard. I found it hard to get engaged. It really takes its time. There's really not much horror in this movie until like midway through the second act, or maybe starting the second act, I guess. The kills are decent, but there's only three of them, so it's a low body count, and there is no real blood or gore in this movie. So if you're thinking 80s slasher from Canada, which also produced My Bloody Valentine, this is not in that same vein. This is much more of a made-for-TV atmospheric kind of creepy horror movie than it is like a full-blown 1980s slasher with blood and guts and nudity and sex and all the rest of that stuff. So just know that going in. The kills are okay. One of them isn't all that exciting, where two people are taken out. The other two are better. And I'll leave it at that. The ending of the movie, it's really weird. It has a quick ending where it's kind of unsatisfying, where we get this big twist reveal and the big climax at the end of the movie, and all of a sudden they start rolling the ending credits on the screen. Well, at the same time, we get is it the sheriff, or is it one of the sheriffs, or one of the officers from the sheriff station is giving an interview, basically talking to a reporter about what happens. That's where we kind of get our ending exposition, kind of like another movie that this is supposed to rip off, or sorry, I mean borrow from. Where am I going with this? It's weird because it's like they end the movie abruptly, and they really didn't need to. I mean, if you're going to give us that little bit of exposition, don't do it over the credits. And then they show the sheriff's department digging up some of the graves in the local cemetery, because apparently they found out where some of the missing people were from the town. I don't know. I just thought the ending was very weird, and how they cut it off like, okay, we need to end it. We need to get out of here, kind of thing. It just felt weird to me. Some of the acting isn't all that good, aside from our leads. I thought Kay Hawtrey and Leslie Donaldson, I thought they were pretty good. But like the guy, I thought Rick Yates, played by Dean Garbett, wasn't anything to write home about. Mr. Davis was good too, by Barry Morse, but everybody else was just kind of meh. I guess for the most part they did what they had to do, but certainly nothing great. The score and the musical cues, again, just like a previous movie that I reviewed for this 1980 horror series, part of the 1980s horror series for 1980 zombie movie. There's a really weird score throughout, especially at the beginning of the movie. To be fair, the score and the musical cues are really weird, more like a Tampax commercial. But in this movie, it's really in the first act before we get into any of the horror. After that, it's just kind of a standard low-budget score, which I guess it works fine, but that's just something that stood out to me. Again, it's like, couldn't you find better, what's the word for the people that bring scores? Music writers, musicians. Why am I having a hard time coming up with what you call the person that puts a score into a fucking movie? I don't know. It was weird, though, to me. Not great. The movie overall has a made-for-TV feel to it, with poor editing, bad scene transitions, lighting and cinematography, just low overall quality to this movie. Now, I know that there's a Scream Factory edition of this movie. I don't know how well they cleaned it up, how much better it looks. Like I said, I watched it off of Shudder, so I'm assuming this is a cut from the original film from 1980 as it was released. But it did feel like I was watching one of those made-for-TV movies, and in that light, it's not the worst horror movie I've ever seen. If you're comparing it to a 1980s theatrical release slasher movie, then it doesn't quite hold up. And then finally, there's a lot of pointless filler in this movie. I thought they could have removed what's the deal with the black cat in this movie, who really does nothing. That's a good example. And as a result, it's just not paced as well as it could have been. I think they could have cut 15 or 20 minutes out of this movie, frankly, and been just fine with the big reveal in the third act with it. So, Funeral Home or Cries of the Night. I prefer Funeral Home, even though Cries of the Night was the original title when it was released in Canada in 1980. Later it became Funeral Home, but I like Funeral Home better as a title. It's not terrible, but it's just not great. It's just kind of a bland, made for TV, low quality kind of movie. I would recommend checking it out simply because you can watch it on Shudder right now, starting with the month of June. I don't know how long it's going to be on Shudder, but it's also on YouTube. So if you want to get an idea of what the movie's about and how it's executed and everything, it's easy to watch. Now, am I going to go out and buy this movie on the Screen Factory edition? Not in a rush. I do think I might rewatch this movie again at some point, but I don't know that I'm going to rush out. It's going for like 20 to 30 bucks at least right now. If you go on eBay or Amazon or something like that. So I'm not going to pay that much right now off a one-time watch, but I would recommend watching this movie for yourself. It is a 1980s slasher movie from Canada, so I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10 overall. I thought there was some good aspects to it, but clearly by my review also some things that really didn't work for me and kind of brought the movie down. So a generous 6 out of 10 for Funeral Home from 1980. Go ahead and comment down below what you guys think of Funeral Home. Do you like it more than I do, less than I do? Why not? I kind of seem to be in the minority because after I watch a new movie that I hadn't seen before, I tend to go out and look at other reviews on YouTube, and a lot of people really like this movie. So I don't know how much of that is the Scream Factory version that they watched, or if they're watching the same movie I am. Another thing I'll mention is, and this is just kind of a funny side bit, and I'm not trying to be a misogynist or anything, but Leslie Donaldson as Heather, I looked her up because she kind of at first struck me as one of those characters that was like 22, 23 playing a teenager. When I looked up her at the actress, like the Leslie Donaldson who plays Heather, it turns out she actually only was 15 or 16 when this movie was made. 16 at most, because it came out in October of 1980. I don't know exactly when they shot it, but her birthday's in April of 1964. So that means she literally at most is 16. And I have to say, she might be the most developed 16-year-old woman I've ever seen before, because, a lot of times in these horror movies, they'll have a 20, 25-year-old actress play a 16 or 17-year-old. And then you kind of say, well, okay, that makes sense. But no, she really was 15 or 16, and wow, she's developed in this role. So just wanted to kind of throw that out there on a little funny side bit. But with that being said, 6 out of 10 for Funeral Home. It's worth checking out, but please like this video, hit the little notification bell, and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of my upcoming reviews for this 1980 horror series, and so you don't miss any of my great horror content beyond this series through the rest of this year and into next. So with that being said, I hope you're enjoying this review series. Hope everybody's doing well, but of course, as always, stay scared. Bye.